The morning of February 14th, 1992, dawned crisp and clear over the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, with temperatures hovering at a brutal 12 degrees below zero. Michael Torres pressed his face against the frost-covered window of the yellow school bus as it wound its way up the narrow mountain road toward Camp Whispering Pines, his breath creating small clouds that quickly froze against the glass. At 12 years old, Michael was smaller than most boys his age, but what he lacked in size, he made up for in determination and an insatiable curiosity about the natural world that surrounded him. "You sure about this, mijo?" his mother Rosa had asked that morning as she packed his duffel bag with extra wool socks and hand warmers. "It's going to be so cold up there." But Michael had been planning this winter survival camp for months, ever since he'd seen the brochure at the Albany YMCA. He'd saved his allowance money, done extra chores, and even convinced his father Eduardo to let him miss 3 days of school. This was his chance to prove he could handle himself in the wilderness, just like the mountain men he read about in his adventure books. The bus pulled up to the rustic wooden lodge just as the sun was beginning to peek over the eastern ridge, casting long purple shadows across the pristine snow. 23 boys between the ages of 10 and 14 climbed out, their excited chatter creating a symphony of voices that echoed off the surrounding pine trees. Michael's best friend Danny Kowalski stuck close beside him, the two boys having been inseparable since meeting in Mrs. Henderson's 4th grade class at Holy Cross Elementary 2 years earlier. Danny was everything Michael wasn't: tall, athletic, confident, but they shared a love of the outdoors that had cemented their friendship through countless camping trips with Troop 47. Camp Director James Patterson stood waiting on the lodge steps, an imposing figure in his forest green parka and wool hat. At 55, Patterson had been running wilderness programs for over 20 years, first as an Army survival instructor and later as a civilian contractor for youth organizations throughout the Northeast. His weathered face spoke of countless hours spent in harsh conditions, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Gentlemen," Patterson called out, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, "welcome to Camp Whispering Pines. Over the next 3 days, you'll learn skills that could save your life if you're ever lost in the wilderness. You'll build shelters, identify edible plants, track animals, and navigate using only a compass and your own 2 feet. But first and most importantly, you'll learn to respect the mountain." He held up a silver whistle, the metal glinting in the early morning sunlight. "Each of you will receive one of these. 3 sharp blasts is the universal signal for help. If you get separated from your group, if you're injured, or if you simply feel overwhelmed, use it. The sound carries far in these mountains, and we will come for you. No exceptions, no questions asked." If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with our viewers around the world. Michael clipped the whistle to the zipper pull of his bright red winter jacket, the same one his mother had insisted on buying, despite his protests that it was too flashy. She'd sewn reflective patches onto the sleeves and back, muttering in Spanish about keeping her son visible in the wilderness. Now, standing in the shadow of the towering mountains, Michael was grateful for her overprotective nature. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, a maze of snow-covered evergreens and rocky outcroppings that could easily swallow a small boy without a trace. The first day passed in a blur of activities. Michael and Danny worked together to build a lean-to shelter using fallen branches and pine boughs, their movements clumsy in the thick winter gloves, but gradually becoming more coordinated as they learned to work with the materials the forest provided. They practiced reading animal tracks in the snow, rabbit prints that looked like tiny hands, the distinctive drag marks left by a porcupine, and the clean, precise tracks of a red fox that had passed through their campsite sometime during the night. "My grandmother used to tell stories about these mountains," Danny said, as they sat around the evening campfire, sharing a thermos of hot chocolate that Patterson had provided. She came here from Poland in 1952, and she always said the Adirondacks reminded her of the Carpathian Mountains back home. She used to say the mountains had secrets, places where people could disappear and never be found. Michael nodded, though his attention was focused on the dark forest beyond the fire's light. He could hear sounds out there, the soft hoot of a great horned owl, the distant howl of coyotes, and underneath it all, a subtle creaking and groaning as the trees adjusted to the extreme cold. It was both beautiful and slightly terrifying, this reminder of how small and vulnerable they were in the face of such raw wilderness. The second day brought new challenges. Patterson divided the boys into pairs and sent them on a navigation exercise, using only a compass and hand-drawn map to find a series of markers hidden throughout the forest. Michael and Danny received coordinates that would take them on a roughly circular route through the woods, ending back at the lodge by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The exercise was designed to test their ability to read terrain, follow compass bearings, and work together under pressure. "Remember," Patterson told them as they prepared to leave, "stay within the marked boundaries. The orange flags mark the safe zone. Don't go beyond them for any reason. These mountains have caves, cliffs, and ravines that can be deadly, especially in winter conditions. If you get confused or turned around, stop where you are and use your whistle. We'd rather come get you than spend the night searching for you." Michael and Danny set off into the forest with confidence, their compass readings precise and their spirits high. The first 3 markers were easy to find, clearly visible orange ribbons tied to prominent trees along well-defined game trails. The 4th marker, however, proved more elusive. According to their map, it should have been located near a distinctive rock formation shaped like a sleeping bear, but after an hour of searching, they couldn't find either the marker or the rocks. "Maybe we're reading the compass wrong," Danny suggested, but Michael was already studying the hand-drawn map with the intensity of a professional surveyor. According to his calculations, they were in exactly the right place. The problem was that the landscape didn't match what was drawn on their paper. It was then that Michael spotted the tracks. Fresh deer prints in the snow, leading away from the marked trail and disappearing into a thick grove of hemlocks. The tracks were clear and deep, indicating a large animal moving recently through the area. More importantly, they seemed to be heading in the direction where the rock formation should have been located. "Look at these," Michael said, kneeling down to examine the prints more closely. "These are from a big buck. See how deep they are. And they're heading toward that ridge. Maybe if we follow them for just a few minutes, we'll find the rocks we're looking for." Danny checked his watch nervously. It was already 2:30 in the afternoon, and they still had to find the final 2 markers before returning to the lodge. But Michael's enthusiasm was infectious, and Danny had learned over the years that his friend's instincts about the outdoors were usually reliable. "Okay," he agreed, "but just for 5 minutes. If we don't find anything, we turn around and stick to the marked trail." The deer tracks led them through the hemlock grove and up a gentle slope toward what appeared to be a rocky outcropping. The trees grew thicker here, their snow-laden branches forming a natural tunnel that blocked out most of the afternoon sunlight. Michael moved ahead, following the tracks with the focused intensity of a predator, while Danny followed a few steps behind, growing increasingly nervous about how far they were traveling from the marked trail. "Michael, we should go back," Danny called out, but his voice seemed muffled by the heavy snow and dense evergreen boughs. "We're getting too far from the trail." But when he looked up, Michael was nowhere to be seen. The deer tracks continued ahead, but his friend had simply vanished as completely as if the forest had opened up and swallowed him whole. Danny stood frozen for a moment, his heart hammering against his ribs as the reality of the situation hit him. He was alone in an unfamiliar part of the forest. The afternoon light was already beginning to fade, and his best friend had disappeared without making a sound. "Michael!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Where are you? This isn't funny!" The forest remained silent except for the soft whisper of wind through the pine needles and the distant dripping of melting snow from the higher branches. Danny pulled out his whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts, the sound echoing off the trees before being absorbed by the thick snow. He waited, listening desperately for an answering whistle, but heard nothing except his own ragged breathing and the thundering of his pulse in his ears. For the next hour, Danny searched frantically through the hemlock grove, calling Michael's name until his throat was raw and his voice was nothing but a whisper. He followed every track he could find, checked behind every large tree and boulder, and even climbed onto several rocky outcroppings to get a better view of the surrounding terrain. But there was no sign of his friend, no tracks, no broken branches, no disturbance in the snow that would indicate where Michael had gone. When Danny finally stumbled back to the lodge at 4:45 p.m., tears freezing on his cheeks and his whole body shaking from cold and fear, Camp Director Patterson took one look at his face and knew something terrible had happened. "Where's Michael?" Patterson demanded, already reaching for his radio and emergency gear. "I don't know," Danny sobbed, the words barely intelligible through his chattering teeth and emotional breakdown. "We were following deer tracks, and then he was just gone. I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find him. It's like he just disappeared into the air." Within 30 minutes, every adult at the camp was mobilized for a search effort. Patterson contacted the New York State Forest Rangers and the local sheriff's department, providing them with the last known location and a detailed description of Michael's clothing and equipment. Rosa and Eduardo Torres received the call at their small house on Delaware Avenue in Albany at 6:15 p.m., just as Rosa was setting the table for dinner. The sound she made when Patterson explained that their son was missing was something Eduardo would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. The couple made the 3-hour drive to the mountains in just over 2 hours, Eduardo's hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, while Rosa sat in the passenger seat, clutching Michael's extra winter jacket and praying in a mixture of English and Spanish. By the time they arrived at Camp Whispering Pines, the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero, and search teams with powerful flashlights were already combing through the forest, their voices calling Michael's name echoing off the mountains like the cries of lost souls. The search that followed consumed the next 72 hours and involved more than 100 volunteers from across the region. New York State Forest Rangers brought in their most experienced tracking dogs, German shepherds trained to follow human scent even in extreme weather conditions. The dogs picked up Michael's trail easily enough at first, following it through the hemlock grove and up toward the rocky ridge where Danny had last seen him. But at a specific point near a jumble of granite boulders, the scent trail simply ended, as if Michael had been lifted bodily from the earth and carried away. "I've never seen anything like it," admitted Ranger Bill Morrison, a 30-year veteran who had found countless lost hikers throughout the Adirondacks. "Usually, even if someone falls down a cliff or gets buried in an avalanche, the dogs can still pick up some trace. But here, it's like the boy just vanished into thin air. There's no scent cone, no direction of travel, nothing." The weather wasn't helping the search efforts. Fresh snow fell almost continuously, covering any tracks or signs of passage that might have provided clues to Michael's whereabouts. Temperatures remained brutally cold, with nighttime lows reaching 20 below zero, conditions that no 12-year-old could survive without proper shelter and equipment. But Rosa Torres refused to accept the implications of what the searchers were telling her. "My son is smart," she insisted to anyone who would listen, her voice hoarse from calling his name through the frozen forest. "He knows how to build a shelter, how to stay warm. He's not just some city kid who doesn't understand the outdoors. She walked the same trails over and over, often accompanied by Eduardo or one of the volunteer searchers, but sometimes alone, following her maternal instincts into parts of the forest that the organized search teams hadn't yet covered. Local volunteers from Lake Placid, Saranac Lake, and other nearby communities joined the effort, bringing thermoses of hot coffee, sandwiches wrapped in aluminum foil, and the kind of unwavering determination that mountain communities are known for. The Kowalski family felt responsible for what had happened. Danny's decision to follow the deer tracks had led to Michael's disappearance, and they threw themselves into the search with desperate energy. Danny's father, Stan, a maintenance worker at the local paper mill, took time off from work to help coordinate volunteer efforts, while Danny's mother, Maria, provided meals and hot drinks for the searchers around the clock. By the end of the first week, the official search area had been expanded to cover more than 50 square miles of wilderness. Helicopters from the New York National Guard flew grid patterns over the mountains, their thermal imaging cameras scanning for any sign of heat that might indicate a survivor. Ground teams rappelled into ravines and explored cave systems that hadn't been mapped since the 1800s, but every lead turned into a dead end. Every promising sign proved to be nothing more than wishful thinking. The hardest moment came on February 21st, exactly 1 week after Michael's disappearance, when the official search was scaled back from active rescue to recovery operation. The temperature hadn't risen above 0 in 7 days, and even the most optimistic experts acknowledged that no child could survive that long in such conditions without shelter. But Rosa Torres rejected the change in status, continuing her own search efforts with a determination that worried her family and friends. "They want me to plan a funeral," she told her sister Carmen during one of their late-night phone conversations. "They want me to accept that my baby is dead and move on with my life. But I know he's out there somewhere. I can feel it in my heart. A mother knows these things. He's waiting for me to find him." The official search was officially called off after 2 weeks, though a few dedicated volunteers continued combing through the wilderness for several more days. Camp Whispering Pines closed permanently that summer, the insurance liability too great for the organization to continue operating. The wooden lodge sat empty for years afterward, paint peeling from its walls and windows boarded up against vandals, a stark reminder of the February day when a 12-year-old boy had walked into the forest and never returned. For Rosa and Eduardo Torres, the end of the official search marked the beginning of a much longer, more personal odyssey. Every weekend, for the next 5 years, they made the 3-hour drive from Albany to spend their days walking through the Adirondack wilderness, following game trails and old logging roads that might have been overlooked by the original search teams. They posted flyers with Michael's photograph in every town from Lake Placid to Tupper Lake, offering a reward that started at $5,000 and gradually increased as Eduardo worked double shifts at the General Electric plant and Rosa took on extra hours at her job as a school secretary. The strain on their marriage was enormous. Eduardo found it increasingly difficult to maintain hope as the months turned into years, and the weekly trips to the mountains became a source of tension rather than shared purpose. He wanted to grieve, to move forward, to perhaps try to have another child, but Rosa remained frozen in time, unable to accept that Michael might truly be gone. Their small house on Delaware Avenue became a shrine to their missing son, his bedroom preserved exactly as he had left it on the morning of February 14th, 1992. "I know you think I'm crazy," Rosa said to Eduardo during one of their increasingly frequent arguments, "but I have dreams about him. He's somewhere dark and cold, but he's alive, and he's waiting for someone to find him. How can I give up when I know he's out there?" Eduardo tried to understand, tried to share his wife's unshakable faith, but the rational part of his mind knew that their son was gone. In 1998, 6 years after Michael's disappearance, he finally asked Rosa for a divorce. The conversation happened on a Sunday evening in March, after they had returned from another fruitless weekend in the mountains. Eduardo packed his belongings that night and moved in with his brother's family in Buffalo, unable to bear another day of watching his wife slowly destroy herself with false hope. Rosa continued her solitary vigil, driving to the mountains every weekend regardless of weather or season. She joined the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children as a volunteer, helping other families navigate the nightmare she knew so intimately. Her work with other missing children cases gave her life purpose and meaning, but it never diminished her certainty that Michael was still alive somewhere in the Adirondack wilderness. Danny Kowalski carried his own burden of guilt and responsibility. The decision to follow those deer tracks had been his as much as Michael's, and not a day passed without him wondering what might have happened if he had insisted they turn back sooner. He threw himself into his studies, graduated from high school with honors, and enrolled in the forestry program at the State University of New York. His goal was simple. He would become a forest ranger, learn everything there was to know about wilderness survival and search and rescue techniques, and maybe someday he would find the answers that had eluded everyone else. After completing his degree and the required training program, Danny was assigned to the Lake George Ranger District, about an hour south of where Michael had disappeared. But in 2001, he requested a transfer to the High Peaks region of the Adirondacks, the area that included the former Camp Whispering Pines and the site of his friend's disappearance. His supervisor approved the transfer, understanding that Danny needed to confront his past in order to move forward with his career. Danny married Sarah Chen, an elementary school teacher from Schenectady, in 2003. Sarah knew about Michael. Everyone in the region knew the story of the boy who had vanished during the winter camp, but Danny rarely spoke about the details of that February afternoon. Even Sarah understood that there were rooms in her husband's heart that remained locked, memories too painful to share even with someone he loved completely. The years passed, and the Michael Torres case faded from public attention. New missing persons cases captured headlines, new tragedies demanded resources and attention, but in the small communities around Lake Placid and Saranac Lake, people still remembered the 12-year-old boy who had disappeared without a trace. His photograph remained posted in post offices and community centers, faded now but still recognizable. A dark-haired boy with bright eyes and a shy smile, frozen forever at the moment, just before he stepped into the forest and vanished from the world. Rosa Torres never remarried, never moved from the house on Delaware Avenue where she had raised her son. Every February 14th, she drove to the mountains and walked the trails, listening for something the search teams might have missed. She was 68 years old on February 14th, 2017, her hair grey now and her step slower than it had been 25 years earlier, but her determination remained as strong as ever. She had no way of knowing that this anniversary would be different from all the others, that after a quarter-century of silence, the mountains were finally ready to give up their secret. The winter of 2016 to 2017 was one of the most severe on record throughout the Northeast. By early February, the Adirondacks had received over 12 feet of snow, with temperatures remaining below zero for weeks at a time. But the storm that hit on February 15th was something extraordinary even by regional standards, a massive weather system that dumped 3 feet of fresh snow in less than 18 hours, accompanied by winds that reached 60 miles per hour and created drifts 8 feet high throughout the mountains. The storm knocked out power lines across 3 counties and closed major highways from Albany to the Canadian border. Emergency shelters were opened in Lake Placid and Saranac Lake for residents who lost heat in their homes, while National Guard units were deployed to help with snow removal and emergency transportation. For 48 hours, the Adirondack region was essentially cut off from the outside world, buried under a blanket of snow that transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and otherworldly. Danny Kowalski, now 37 years old and a district ranger with 15 years of experience, was among the first to venture out when the storm finally passed on the morning of February 17th. His job was to check on several remote locations where ice climbers and winter hikers had been known to camp, making sure that no one had been trapped or injured by the unprecedented snowfall. The roads were still impassable, so Danny traveled on snowshoes, following routes he had memorized during his years patrolling this section of the mountains. His first stop was Chapel Pond, a popular destination for ice climbers who came to scale the frozen waterfalls that formed each winter along the granite cliffs. Danny found evidence that a group had been camping there recently, tracks and equipment marks that were almost completely buried by the new snow, but no sign of people in distress. He was preparing to continue his rounds when he heard something that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. 3 sharp whistle blasts carried on the crystal-clear air that follows a major snowstorm. The sound was faint but unmistakable, echoing across the frozen landscape like a voice from the past. Danny stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, as his mind processed what he had just heard. It had been 25 years since he had heard that exact signal, but the memory was burned into his consciousness like a brand. Danny keyed his radio with trembling fingers, his voice barely steady enough to form words. "Base, this is Ranger Kowalski. I'm hearing whistle signals in the Chapel Pond area, approximately 2 miles northeast of the old Camp Whispering Pines site. Requesting immediate backup and search and rescue support." The response crackled back through the static. "Copy that, Danny. Are you certain about the whistle signals? That area's been a dead zone for years. No one camps there in winter." But Danny was already moving, his snowshoes carrying him across the pristine snow toward the sound, with the desperate urgency of someone who had waited 25 years for this moment. The whistle blasts came again, definitely closer now, and seeming to originate from somewhere in the valley below Chapel Pond. Danny followed the sound through terrain that had been completely transformed by the storm. Fallen trees created new barriers, familiar landmarks were buried under massive snowdrifts, and even the most well-known trails were invisible beneath the fresh accumulation. But the whistle kept calling, always just ahead, always just out of sight, like a signal from another world trying to break through into this one. As Danny descended into the valley, following what he thought was probably an old stream bed, the whistle signals became more frequent and more distinct. Someone was definitely out there, someone in distress who was using the standard emergency signal. But who could possibly be in this remote area after such a massive storm? And why did the sound trigger such powerful memories of that terrible February day 25 years ago? The terrain grew more challenging as Danny moved deeper into the valley. The storm had brought down dozens of large trees, creating a maze of fallen timber that he had to navigate carefully to avoid injury. Snowdrifts reached above his head in some places, and more than once he had to backtrack when his route proved impassable. But always the whistle signals guided him forward, growing stronger and more urgent as the afternoon light began to fade. It was nearly 4 o'clock when Danny found himself in a narrow ravine he had never seen before, flanked by steep granite walls that the storm had stripped almost bare of snow. The whistle signals were coming from somewhere just ahead, echoing off the rock faces in a way that made it difficult to pinpoint the exact location. The acoustics were strange here, as if the sound was coming from below ground level rather than from somewhere in the open air. "Hello?" Danny called out, his voice hoarse with emotion and physical exhaustion. "Can anyone hear me? This is New York State Forest Service. Keep blowing that whistle." The response nearly brought him to his knees. A voice, thin and weak but undeniably human, called back from somewhere in the jumble of rocks ahead. "Help! Down here! I can't get out!" Danny stumbled forward through the snow, following the voice toward what he had initially thought was just a collection of fallen boulders. But as he got closer, he realized that the rocks concealed something much more significant, the entrance to what appeared to be a cave or underground chamber, carefully camouflaged with weathered wood and stones that had been deliberately placed to hide the opening from casual observation. Using his flashlight, Danny peered into the darkness beyond the concealed entrance. What he saw defied every rational explanation his mind could conjure. A man sat huddled against the back wall of what was clearly a much larger underground space, wrapped in what appeared to be an old sleeping bag and several layers of worn, makeshift clothing. He was thin, almost skeletal, with long grey hair and a beard that reached his chest, but his eyes, those dark brown eyes that Danny remembered from countless childhood adventures, were unmistakably those of Michael Torres. "Danny?" the man whispered, raising one trembling hand to shield his eyes from the flashlight beam. "Is that really you? How long have I been down here?" Danny's legs gave out, and he collapsed into the snow at the entrance to the cave, his mind reeling with an impossibility that his eyes were forcing him to accept. The boy, who had disappeared at age 12, was somehow here, alive, looking like he had aged 25 years in the underground darkness. The rescue operation that followed became the stuff of legend throughout the Adirondack region. Emergency crews worked through the night to safely extract the man from the cave system, which geological surveys later revealed to be part of an extensive underground network that had been mapped by 19th-century explorers but forgotten for over a century. The cave complex extended for miles beneath the mountains, with multiple chambers connected by narrow passages that would have been nearly impossible to navigate without extensive spelunking experience. The man claimed to be Michael Torres, and preliminary medical examination seemed to support his claim. He appeared to be approximately 37 years old, exactly what Michael's age should have been in 2017. DNA samples were taken immediately and rushed to the state crime lab in Albany for comparison with samples from Rosa Torres and other family members. The results, which came back 48 hours later, confirmed what seemed impossible. This was indeed Michael Torres, the boy who had vanished without a trace on February 14, 1992. But the medical findings raised more questions than they answered. Michael showed signs of severe malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies consistent with years of extremely limited food sources, but he was alive, conscious, and able to walk with assistance. His muscle mass was severely diminished, his skin was pale and thin from lack of sunlight, and his dental health showed the effects of a diet consisting primarily of groundwater and whatever small animals or insects he had been able to catch in the cave system. Most puzzling of all, Michael's memories of the underground years were fragmentary and dreamlike. He remembered falling through what must have been a concealed opening in the forest floor, tumbling down a rocky slope into the cave system below. He had vague recollections of wandering through the darkness for what seemed like days or weeks, following underground streams and trying to find a way back to the surface. But beyond those initial memories, his recollection of the past 25 years was like a half-remembered dream, filled with impressions of cold, darkness, and the constant sound of dripping water. "I kept the whistle," Michael told the emergency room doctors, pulling the tarnished silver object from his pocket. "Every day I would blow it 3 times, hoping someone would hear. I never stopped believing someone would come for me." The whistle was indeed the same one issued by Camp Whispering Pines in 1992, its surface worn smooth by 25 years of handling, but still capable of producing the clear, sharp notes that had guided Danny through the storm. Rosa Torres received the call at her home on Delaware Avenue at 11:30 p.m. on February 17th. She'd been expecting news about the storm cleanup, perhaps information about road closures or power outages. Instead, she heard words that she had dreamed of hearing for 25 years. "Mrs. Torres, this is Dr. Patricia Williams at Albany Medical Center. We have a man here who claims to be your son, Michael. We're going to need you to come in for identification as soon as possible." The drive to Albany took Rosa exactly 47 minutes, though she had no memory of making the trip. She walked into the emergency room at 12:17 a.m. on February 18, 2017, exactly 25 years and 4 days after her son had disappeared into the Adirondack wilderness. The reunion was witnessed by hospital staff, emergency personnel, and news crews who had begun gathering as word of the impossible rescue spread throughout the region. "Mommy," Michael whispered, as Rosa approached his hospital bed, using the same pet name he had called her as a 12-year-old child. "I'm sorry I was gone so long. I tried to find my way back, but I couldn't remember which way was home." Rosa collapsed into the chair beside his bed, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch her son's face, to confirm that this was real, and not another of the dreams that had sustained her through 25 years of searching. The medical mystery of Michael Torres became an international sensation within hours of the news breaking. Reporters from around the world descended on Albany, drawn by a story that seemed to defy every law of nature and human survival. How could a 12-year-old boy survive alone in an underground cave system for 25 years? How had he aged normally while apparently sustaining himself on groundwater and whatever small creatures he could catch in the darkness? Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, a specialist in extreme survival cases at Johns Hopkins University, flew to Albany to examine Michael and study his case. "What we're seeing here challenges everything we know about human physiology and survival psychology," she told reporters. "The fact that he maintained his sanity while living in complete isolation for 25 years is remarkable enough. But the physical survival aspects are almost impossible to explain with current medical knowledge." The cave where Michael was found contained extensive evidence of long-term human habitation. Primitive tools fashioned from rocks and animal bones, crude bedding made from moss and fur, the remnants of countless small fires built near a natural chimney that provided ventilation. All suggested someone who had not only survived in the underground environment, but had actually adapted to it over time. Anthropologists studying the site compared the survival strategies to those used by prehistoric humans, marveling at the ingenuity required to sustain life in such harsh conditions. But perhaps the most puzzling aspect of the entire case was Michael's apparent lack of aging during his years underground. While he appeared to be 37 years old, the correct age for someone born in 1979, medical tests suggested that his cellular aging had somehow been slowed or altered during his time in the cave system. Some researchers theorized about unknown environmental factors that might affect human metabolism, while others suggested that extreme cold and limited food sources might trigger hibernation-like states that could slow the aging process. Eduardo Torres flew in from Buffalo for the reunion, bringing with him his second wife Linda and their 2 teenage daughters, Sofia and Elena. The meeting was emotional and complicated. Eduardo had to confront not only the return of the son he had mourned for 25 years, but also the realization that his grief had led him to abandon the wife who had never stopped believing their child was alive. "I'm sorry, Rosa," Eduardo said during their first conversation in nearly 20 years. "I should have believed. I should have kept searching with you." But Rosa showed no bitterness toward her ex-husband, only gratitude that their family was finally complete again. "You did what you thought was right," she told him. "What matters is that he's home now." Michael's adjustment to the modern world proved challenging in ways that no one had anticipated. Technology had advanced dramatically during his 25 years underground. The internet, cell phones, GPS navigation, and countless other innovations that seemed magical to someone whose last memory of the surface world was from 1992. But more difficult than the technological changes were the social and emotional adaptations required to reconnect with family members who had aged and changed while he remained frozen in time. Danny Kowalski visited Michael every day during his month-long hospital stay, the two friends slowly rebuilding a relationship that had been interrupted by 25 years of separation. Michael was fascinated by the changes in Danny's life. His career as a forest ranger, his marriage to Sarah, their 3 children, who were now older than Michael had been when he disappeared. But he was most interested in hearing about the search efforts, particularly his mother's unwavering determination to find him. She never gave up, Danny told him during one of their conversations. Every weekend for years, she would drive up to the mountains and walk the trails, calling your name. Even when everyone else said you were gone, she knew you were still out there somewhere. Michael listened to these stories with wonder and deep gratitude, understanding for the first time how his disappearance had affected not just his immediate family, but an entire community that had never stopped hoping for his return. The Torres family faced the complex challenge of rebuilding relationships that had been frozen in time for a quarter century. Rosa had to adjust to her son being a grown man with his own thoughts, opinions, and perspectives, while Michael struggled to understand that his mother had aged from a vibrant 43-year-old to a grandmother approaching 70. The dynamics were further complicated by Eduardo's second family. Sofia and Elena had grown up hearing stories about their missing half-brother, but meeting him in person was a surreal experience that challenged their understanding of family and loss. As the initial media frenzy died down, Michael began the slow process of building a life in the modern world. He enrolled in adult education classes to earn his high school equivalency diploma, something that proved surprisingly easy given his vast self-taught knowledge of survival skills, natural sciences, and practical problem-solving. The New York State Department of Education granted him special recognition for his unique educational background, acknowledging that his 25 years of wilderness survival had provided him with knowledge and skills that couldn't be measured by traditional academic standards. Michael found work at a local outdoor equipment store, where his extensive practical knowledge of survival techniques made him invaluable to customers planning camping and hiking trips. His co-workers and customers were initially drawn by his celebrity status. He was, after all, the man who had survived 25 years alone in a cave. But they quickly came to respect him for his genuine expertise and his quiet, thoughtful approach to life. He never married or had children of his own, though not for lack of opportunities. Several women expressed interest in him, drawn by his unique story and his gentle, introspective nature. But Michael seemed content with a simple, quiet life, focused on reconnecting with his family and helping others appreciate the natural world that had been both his prison and his salvation for so many years. The psychological impact of his experience remained largely private. Michael worked with several therapists specializing in trauma and isolation, but he rarely spoke publicly about the emotional toll of his 25 years underground. Those who knew him best, Rosa, Danny, and eventually his half-sisters, understood that there were aspects of his experience that he would never be able to fully share. Memories and emotions too profound and complex for ordinary language to convey. Rosa Torres lived to see her 75th birthday in 2024, passing away peacefully with Michael holding her hand. At her funeral, she was remembered not just as the mother who never gave up hope, but as a woman who had helped dozens of other families navigate the nightmare of missing children through her volunteer work with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The Rosa Torres Memorial Fund was established in her honor, providing support services and resources for families facing similar tragedies. Michael still lives in the house on Delaware Avenue where he grew up, though he has made some modifications to accommodate his unique needs and preferences. The basement has been converted into a workshop where he crafts primitive tools and survival equipment, skills he learned during his underground years and now shares with wilderness education programs throughout the Northeast. The backyard features a small garden where he grows herbs and vegetables using techniques adapted from his cave-dwelling experience. Every February 14th, Michael returns to the Adirondack Mountains, though not to the exact location where he was found. That cave system has been sealed by the state for safety reasons. Instead, he hikes to an overlook near the former site of Camp Whispering Pines, where he can see across the vast wilderness that was both his childhood adventure destination and his adult survival challenge. He carries the silver whistle on a cord around his neck, never more than arm's reach away. Sometimes, on clear winter days when the sound carries far across the snow-covered mountains, Michael Torres stands at the edge of the forest and blows 3 sharp blasts on that whistle, not a call for help anymore, but a signal to anyone who might be lost that they are not forgotten, that someone is still listening, and that even after 25 years of silence, hope can echo across the wilderness and guide the lost ones home. The mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes, just sometimes, they give them back.